This week on Islamic Markets Briefing, we will cover Islamic banking acceptance among young Muslims, the financial results of some leading Islamic banks, UAE's artificial intelligence ambitions, and halal food marketing in the ASEAN region. On Expert Talks, we'll be hearing from Bashar al Natoor, Global Head of Islamic Finance at Fitch Ratings, on Sukuk market developments in the first half of 2021. The Asian Development Bank's Trade and Supply Chain Finance Program has entered into an agreement with Dubai Islamic Bank Pakistan Limited with the aim of supporting trade in Pakistan. ADB expects to help DIB Pakistan to further develop its trade finance business within Pakistan and generate more trade flows in the country. The program has arranged more than $17.3 billion in trade within Pakistan to date, with support being granted across industries like steel, polypropylene, fertilizers, and machinery for garments and weaving. Saudi banks are seeing improved performance led by growth in mortgages and an economic recovery in 2021 following the easing of the pandemic-led lockdowns. Al Rajhi Bank recorded 3.61 billion Saudi Arabia riyals in net income in the second quarter of 2021 ended June, up 48% year-over-year and 32% year-over-year increase in operating profit led by an increase in income from special commissions, financing and investments. Abu Dhabi Islamic Bank recorded a net profit of 1.1 billion dirham for the first half of 2021, an increase of 89% year-over-year, driven by growth in total revenue. Abu Dhabi Islamic Bank noted that this top-line performance came on the back of strong improvements in customer financing, customer deposits, along with increases in fees and commissions and investment income. Kuwait Finance House reported a net profit of 102.2 million Kuwaiti dinar for the first half of 2021, an increase of 79.5% compared to the same period last year. Hamad Al Marzouk, KFH chairman, said that the bank's liquidity ratios remained higher than the regulatory requirements, whilst non-performing financials decreased with higher coverage ratios, adding that the asset quality and the capital efficiency have improved. Maybank Indonesia saw 762 billion Indonesian rupiah in profit before tax in the first half of 2021. Maybank Indonesia's Sharia banking unit's profit before tax was up 67.6%, reaching 294 billion Indonesian rupiah in the same period despite adverse market conditions. According to a recent report issued by the cloud banking platform Mambu, 53% of millennial and Gen Z Islamic finance customers out of 2,000 surveyed said they are open to adopt Islamic banking if barriers to entry were removed. 74% of young Muslims want to invest in banks that are in accordance with their religious beliefs, while 75% want to make investments that do good in the world. The multi-trillion-dollar Islamic finance industry is driven by fintech, which is expected to reach the $125 billion mark by 2025, with the younger generation anticipated to account for 3/4 of all Islamic banking revenue by 2023. With almost 80% of UAE's digital payments being contactless, AI plays a crucial role in digital payments within the country. PricewaterhouseCoopers predicts that AI will contribute up to $320 billion to the Middle East economy in the next 10 years. Sakar bin Ghalib, director of the artificial intelligence at UAE's Prime Minister's office, stated that the government of the UAE has mandated the doubling of the size of the country's digital economy within the next 10 years. More than 50% of consumers within GCC shop online and make digital payments, with the Middle East and North Africa region set to expand at a compound annual growth rate of over 13% in the coming few years. Brunei Darussalam was represented by the Ministry of Religious Affairs through its Sharia Affairs Department at the 17th Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, Working Group on Halal Food Marketing. The meeting discussed the updates on the Plan of Action for ASEAN Cooperation in Halal Food 2021 to 2025 and the setting up of the International Halal Authority Board. The ASEAN Working Group on Halal Food was established with the objective of enabling uniform halal standards in the ASEAN region. It also caters to the increasing demands for certified halal goods and services and ensures the Muslim community on the credibility of halal foods. The onset of the pandemic in 2020 brought with it a record number of Sukuk issuances, which came in at over $170 billion compared to $169 billion in 2019. With oil prices tumbling to $10 per barrel in April 2020 from $63.27 per barrel in January 2020, and most countries implementing COVID-19 lockdown measures, governments in key Sukuk markets saw a more urgent need for financing aimed at easing the impact of the pandemic. This led to a ramp-up in sovereign Sukuk issuances during the first 9 months of 2020 as governments rolled out extensive stimulus packages.
At the beginning of the last year, in the first quarter, we had the COVID hitting the markets where Islamic finance is active. This year, you have the vaccination rollout, and on top of that, you have some regulatory changes. But just going a little bit backwards, Sukuk has faced these challenges many times before. And from 2015 till 2020 or the first quarter here, it almost doubled from almost $340 billion to now we're talking around 715 billion outstanding Sukuk globally. So you can see that the industry has grown significantly. And I think the trend will continue to be there. And this year is no difference. At the beginning of this year, we had an introduction of new requirements in the Sukuk documentation. At the back of the Higher Sharia Authority push for IOFI Sharia standards to be implemented and getting more clarity and guidance from the Higher Sharia Authority to the banking sector, where although you can look at it and say this is a UAE regulation, which is the actual focus for anything that falls under the umbrella of Islamic banks. However, the Islamic banking industry in the UAE plays 3 key major roles, which is a major issuer of Sukuk, a major investor in Sukuk, and a major arranger of Sukuk. Thus, the implication of that was on the wider Sukuk market. And we saw almost a standstill in February and March to some extent, but the innovation in the industry is part of its DNA. And if you look at what we have, the trend has continued in this year. So if you look at the actual Sukuk industry in its growth, continued in H1, and we expect that to continue in the coming quarters. Maybe you'll have some quiet period in summer, but after that is the market will come back.
Key Sukuk issuing nations have been ramping up vaccination drives against COVID-19, which should naturally increase the need for funding. However, the impact of the recovery in oil prices has been positive for oil exporters. In addition, excessive borrowings and measures taken to narrow fiscal deficits saw a reduced need for sovereigns, particularly in Saudi Arabia, to tap into capital markets in the fourth quarter of 2020.
The vaccination has a multi-dimensional impact. And in many of the countries where Islamic finance is active, some of these countries are oil exporters, and some of these countries are oil importers. Now, if you look at the GCC and the oil exporters there, the recovery of economies had, and the rollout of vaccination and the opening up had an impact on many dimensions. But one key one is the recovery of oil prices. And we've revised recently our outlook for the average oil price in 2021 to 63. And the oil prices that we have now is 70. So that is something is very much linked to the need to fund. And that is something that is very important. So many of the governments have their funding needs, specifically when you had COVID-19 and the rollout of the support mechanisms to their economies. The funding need increased and the funding gap was bigger, and thus they wanted to fund that gap in terms of Sukuk or bonds. This year, with the oil prices higher, and specifically for oil exporters, we did not see a significant issuance coming from these countries, but the push for diversification of funding continues to be there. And we saw significant issuance coming from various players in the market, whether sovereigns, financial institutions, or corporates. And some of them first corporates, like we saw Aramco, for example, in Saudi Arabia, issuing a $6 billion Sukuk, which is the largest corporate Sukuk ever that we've seen. You've seen on the other side, the oil importers. We saw Indonesia issuing, we saw Turkey issuing, we saw Oman, which is still in the Gulf, also issuing. And I think the pipeline will continue to be there for other sovereigns to enter in the market. Saudi Arabia issued Sukuk locally and continued their local Saudi Riyal issuance. And we saw some banks having an opportunistic issuances because of the low interest environment. And why do I say banks are opportunistic when they come to issuance? Because banks are largely deposit funded. Islamic banks are largely deposit funded. So the issuance of Sukuk is something that they take as an opportunity when they feel that the market and the environment and the cost of that option is viable to them.
Since the beginning of the pandemic, diversification in Islamic capital markets has been trending, with a rise in ESG, green Sukuk, and more recently, retail Sukuk. In late 2020, Malaysia issued digital retail Sukuk worth of $119 million. Indonesia issued retail Sukuk of over $342 million, and Oman's first Omani Riyal sovereign Sukuk worth of $64.9 million was fully subscribed by individual investors. However, according to Fitch Ratings, retail issuances are a small segment in the global Sukuk market, and whilst it may suit some countries like Nigeria, where retail investors are a core part of the Sukuk industry, further developments may be needed within debt capital markets where Islamic finance is active for this to take off.
If you're looking at how much a sovereign issues internationally or a big corporate issues internationally, and these retail issuances, it's a bit, I would say, small, if it's called and labeled as a retail issuance. However, we saw other countries taking an option of opening the retail, the regular Sukuk to retail market by having a smaller size ticket. And that opens the door to these, to the retail of participating in regular, I would say, Sukuk issuance. So I would say it's a step that is giving some width. I mean, in countries like Nigeria, for example, the retail Sukuk, the retail investor is a significant part of the Sukuk story, which is not the case in other countries. And if you look at the GCC, for example, or what have you, it's not the same. So I think it's a country by country, and the demographics of that will really shape how the industry. It's a step that is supportive, but I don't think that we will see this as becoming a big chunk of Sukuk in the short to medium term. Let's see how it acts and how it's built. It's still at an early stage in many of these countries. It might go to the other dimension. Now, there is a lot of, I would say, diversification and enlarging the platform of Sukuk that we're seeing. So whether on ESG and green, and that is something that we've seen significantly increasing. So if we look at the issuance in this year, we had a lot of issuance that is a continuation of what we saw in 2020 and 2019. And I think that trend also is giving diversification. We're seeing corporates coming to the market. We're seeing not senior and secured credit. We're seeing some subordination coming in banks. They're issuing tier one Sukuk. So the widening of the offering of Sukuk is important because it attracts a wider audience. And so we're seeing that whether on retail, whether on ESG, whether on the ranking of the Sukuk, whether from the issuer itself being a sovereign or a corporate. And that is something that we've seen developed over the years. And I think the development is also evident. And it was not even held back in 2020 where we saw few firsts being registered there. And that trend is in 2021, and we expect that to continue. And something that I always say, so the whole industry, the whole Islamic finance industry is at the back of a need that made a lot of key stakeholders to innovate and bring products to the table. And I think that trend is very essential, and that trend will continue to enlarge the investor base and the interest of Sukuk and Islamic finance in general.
Despite the overall development of Sukuk, some countries are performing better than others.
I think the key ingredient is the development story of capital debt market in regions where Islamic finance is active. And this is a key point. You have some of them just entering into the market in 2016 and 17. You still have the corporates not yet there and issuing. You have the financial institution being very selective and funded by deposits. Some of the governments they disappear for a few years and then come back and issue a sukuk or a bond. So I think that it's one of the puzzle pieces of the development story of the debt capital market in countries where Islamic finance is active. And then you will need to go the extra mile to accommodate that. Some will use this as an inclusive instrument to give an offering. Some will use this to attract a wider investor base and actually get that money. But in some countries, many of the retail customers, they don't even have bank accounts. So the bankability, and I'm not talking about retail investors, I'm talking about just bankability, having a bank account or being under obtain a loan, is really something. If you look at the wider Islamic universe, which is almost a quarter of the population of Earth, it's really at a very low place. You have around 67% of unbanked population. And I think this retail for Sukuk or even bonds is a step, but there is other necessities to develop the capital market first. There is even other necessities to have access to financing and a bank account. So I think it is there, but I think there is a lot of other steps that needs to develop to see this as a visible part of the Islamic finance industry globally.
For the coming months, industry experts are forecasting more sustainability-linked issuance as a continuity from last year, entry or re-entry of new players, and more market developments.
So let's maybe try to focus on the top 5 developments, positive and negative. Developments, challenges, opportunities, and whatever. So I think the green, sustainable, so we've seen transitional, we've seen sustainable, we've seen green. And actually, if you look at the actual numbers, the issuance so far of this year is more than all what has been issued in 2020 in terms of ESG-related Sukuk. So we're talking about around 6 billion of issuances so far in 2021. And the whole year, last year was around that number. So that trend is definitely continuing, and we'll see that. But there is other challenges. There is a push from regulators to do standardization and centralization, which is in the long term could actually help the industry. But now there is challenges of adoptions, understanding what is the need of that, and that is a development that we need to stop and focus on. There is another development, which we've expected and looked at, that you will have more challenging environment where we could actually start seeing defaults of Sukuk. And this also something that we're starting to see, distressed Sukuk and how it's dealt with. That's important because it is important to see how is the recovery path, how is the restructuring path, how is the court systems will react in terms of Sukuk. We had some of these challenges historically that put the industry on a standstill for a short period of time. But so far, what we've seen in 2020, although yes, we're seeing an uptick of more of these distressed Sukuk, but in general, the default Sukuk globally, till date, they're not more than their 0.25%. So they're almost 0.25% of the whole global Sukuk universe. So it's very small. But we're seeing a more distressed scenario. So far, we did not see any of these companies or restructuring or distressed debt claiming and playing the Sharia card. They're going in an orderly way. Let's see. We're monitoring that development and seeing how. So this is the third development. The fourth development is the part of the oil prices, inflation, and interest rate environment, which impacts the appetite not only for Sukuk but for emerging market where most of the Sukuk market is there, and how is that panning out. And the fifth one is the entry or the re-entry of some new players. So you have some new players entering into the market, like the Maldives entered, and re-entries like Malaysia. They've issued an international sukuk this year. Turkey issued another sukuk this year, and they're not very regular in terms of issuing international sukuk. So this is why I see the UK issued a sukuk. So these re-entries and new entries also will support the market.